Well, hello everybody and welcome. My name is Ana Maria Rea-Ventre. I am the Vice President for our Advocacy Department here at RAICES. And I will be your host for this conversation about half-brothers and immigration and the many forms of family separation, particularly as it happens here in the United States. I hope that you enjoyed the special screening of Half Brothers. I know I did. I loved it. It was great. We're very grateful to Focus Features and to Eduardo Cisneros for the opportunity to have this funny and heartwarming comedy about two very different half brothers that are thrown together on an anticipated journey that kind of forces them to confront a lot of misconceptions and gain insight as they learn to view the world from a very different lens. So I'm super excited to be here with Eduardo, especially because here at RAICES, we really believe in seeing a systemic change, a complete paradigm shift on the narrative and the way that we story tell immigration stories, because it really affects how we view our community. As we always say here at RAICES, the law is downstream from culture. And so understanding how to truly and appropriately tell our stories is extremely important. And so that's why I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to talk to Eduardo Cisneros, who is a writer and producer of Half Brothers. And so we're super excited to have you, Eduardo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. As I was telling you, this is already the highlight of my week. It's only Monday, but I'm a big fan of the work of RAICES. Huge fan for years now, and I'm so thrilled to be here now talking to you guys.
Awesome. I'm super excited to get to talk to you, and as I'm sure many of the people that are joining us are as well, because as I watched the film, and I'm sure many will share the sentiment, it was a very different way of seeing our stories being told. We more often than not, we see films about immigration sticking to a very not so true stereotype of who we are as people, who we are as immigrants. I'm Mexican, who we are as Mexicans. And so it was really interesting to see a lot of that in your films. So I understand that you conceived the idea for this project back in 2014, kind of reflecting and based on your own experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so at the time, I would take it even a step further back because as some of you might know, I was a part of the creative team, and I had a big hand in writing the movie Instructions Not Included with Eugenio, and which was released in 2013. And to be honest, at that time, we took about 10 years to develop that script and that project. But at the time, we were just thinking about the emotion of that story was about family, and it was about parenthood. And it wasn't necessarily created to talk so much about specific issues regarding immigration. It just so happened that the story happened in that realm. When it came out, then I started seeing on social media people posting about their connection to the movie, especially at the time I was already living in the US. And I started seeing people posting photos of them with their families at the movie theater and saying, this is Abuelita. She hasn't been to the movie since Titanic, right? She hasn't been to the movie in 15 years. I had a writer, another Mexican-American Hollywood writer, friend of mine, when we had our first general meeting, before we started talking business, he's like, I just have to tell you that my parents came from Mexico 25 years ago, and they never had a movie date in the United States. They'd never been to a movie date in American soil until Instructions Not Included came out. So that got me thinking about the subject of erasure, right? It got me thinking about just how powerful that is to see ourselves on screen. And then I started noticing that, you know, we don't have the opportunity to tell our stories from our perspective most of the time. And that was 2013 and still happens today. So it all started like coalescing around the theme of empathy, about what it feels to walk a mile in somebody's shoes. I started talking about my own experience, or thinking about my own experience as an immigrant in the US. And I have my parents and my siblings in Mexico, and they're still living there. And I would be in touch with them, and I would talk to them, and I would try to explain a lot of the minutia of what happens, a lot of what it feels to be here. But a lot of it is just, even though I'm a writer, I'm supposed to be good with words. It is hard for us who are on este lado, you know, to communicate with how it feels to be inside, and how you're perceived, and the little things that might not seem that much at the time, but when you add them up, they affect you. So that was a big impetus for me to start writing the story of this father who's on this side, and his son who's on the other side, and how the noise, the distance, the barriers start diluting the family and diluting the communication, and in the end result is diluting empathy. So he has no empathy from the people back home in Mexico, and no empathy from the people here who perceive him as a criminal, or somebody who's still here to steal a job. So it's a very lonely place to be. So that was a big motivation behind the story.
Yeah, I love that, Eduardo, because it's so true. You know, I'm an immigrant myself, and just based on the movie and how Renato's dad was portrayed, I love that you highlighted how there's a lack of understanding of what it's like to be an immigrant back home. And so some of that empathy is lost there. And then there's a whole bunch of misconceptions and complexities that play a huge role into how we're perceived as humans, as people, and how we're deserving of the same things and opportunity, and how that creates such a lonely world, you know. And just thinking back of the film and Renato's dad and what he experienced, we often see very similar, the same themes really in the directly impacted community that we do serve and that we do lead in this issue with. And it's interesting to see how that piece of loneliness is something we don't really speak of often, or something that we don't highlight. So I love that you shared that, and I love that that's a piece of the film that inspired you. I really like that. I know that back in 2019, during the pre-production of the film, you actually reached out to our organization to talk about what immigration as an issue and as a systematic process actually looks like for the United States. When I first read about this, I was very grateful that that was something that you took upon yourself to do. Again, kind of going back to the introduction and what I stated, how our stories are so misrepresented, underrepresented, or not at all. It was really great to hear that a producer, a writer, really wanted to depict this issue in a proper light, in a culturally competent light, in highlighting the realities of things that immigrants face. So that being said, what was your sentiment behind really wanting? I want to hear what you felt in wanting to reach out to an organization and actually learn. A lot of writers and producers don't do that when depicting this issue. So, yeah, what drove you to talking to us?
Well, I would start going back again to that year when I started thinking about this story in 2013, 2014. At the time, I was also developing another idea with Ali Leroy, who is a very accomplished writer. He's Chris Rock's writing partner, created Everybody Hates Chris. So he had an idea for this story whose main characters are Mexican immigrants in Chicago. And he wanted to write that screenplay, but he was looking for writers of the culture to collaborate with and write the story together. And he started reading people, etc., and material, and eventually we clicked and we started working on that idea together. But I started also just meditating a little bit on that. At the time, it just seemed so such like not a big thing when somebody just said, you know, I'm gonna write this story. I'm not of that culture. So I think in order to portray that accurately, I need a voice of that culture. And so here we have this Ali, who's a Black man from Chicago and an accomplished screenwriter, doesn't need any help writing a script. And he has the perspective to say, it doesn't belong to me, right? I need somebody from the culture to help me craft that, even though at the time I was like such a junior screenwriter. So as I started, you know, Instructions Not Included came out, and I got a 2-picture deal at Fox out of that. I started becoming more involved in the big leagues and the development process in Hollywood. And I realized that that's not the norm, right? That there's a lot of stories about us that are told without us in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to be very aware on my end that I notice how I'm often the only brown person in the room. I'm the only Latino, and even though we are writing a story about Latinx culture, about Mexicans, I'm the only person of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what that happens is that then they turn to you and they're like, what would a Mexican do, right? Does this will resonate this with the culture? And I'm like, I don't want to be the ambassador for every Latinx person.
Yeah.
We are not a monolith, and
Mm-hmm.
we have different experiences. My experience as an immigrant has been very different from a person who also maybe came from Mexico and moved to Texas, or different times too.
Yeah.
With that time before ICE was invented and all those things. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't even trying to pretend that I knew everything when it comes to like an immigrant experience. So um, and being able to put the audience inside the experience and in the shoes of somebody who was going through all those things at the time, um, it was very essential. And I do have to say the script that we were all very happy with was just maybe a few minutes longer, but it was a little bit more, even more rich in detail. But sometimes, you know, you have to make sacrifices when you're saying, well, do I stick with this longer version, or do I get the movie made, right?
Yeah.
'Cause, you have to be responsible with the money you're given, etc. So, but we wanted to hopefully make people understand that being an undocumented immigrant in 2020, it's a very different thing that it was in 1995 when Flavio was here, and how we were treated, the good things, the things that have improved,
Mm-hmm.
the things that have stayed the same, sadly, or maybe gotten a little bit worse.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, who better than the people there in the front lines, uh, fighting this battle? And bear in mind that conceptually this started way before the current administration even
Mm-hmm.
appeared on the radar. Like this, we started gestating this story in 2013. So imagine what it was like, the writing process, 2015, 16, 17, 18, right? So
Yeah.
um it became more and more crucial to say, let's talk with facts, right? Let's talk with what the reality is. Let's avoid even sensationalizing, but also let's avoid minimizing or trivializing the way things are. And it was very helpful too, because I read a lot about the subject and I can be very informed, but I had to have obviously a lot of conversations with the studio where they would go like, oh, do people really do that? Or is this happening this way? And I would go, I don't want to say I read on, I saw on MSNBC that this happens. I would say like I've reached out to the people who are dealing with this, and this is the information they have, and these things do happen, right? So it wouldn't be so subjective. So thank you so much, guys, for lending your support. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, this kind of is a nice segue into what I wanted to ask you next, because reality is that we all speak about immigration under so many different lights, right? We see immigration as a heavily politicized issue, when in reality it's an issue of human rights. And it's been grossly politicized to dehumanize and to deconstruct the morality of what it really boils down to. And so in the film, I recall you touching upon many different things that our community experience on the daily to this day, that they're still experiencing, anywhere from detention, the conditions in detention, the ill treatment that they receive. There are a lot of people in detention who do not receive medical attention, people who die in detention centers, children who have died in detention centers. And a big one that I want to ask you about is obviously something that we were heavily involved in was the 2018 mass family separation. And something that is really important to us is that people understand that family separation has been happening for so long, that right now we tend to go back to 2018 family separation at the border, but reality is that their family separation has been happening much like you depicted it in the film, with Renato and Flavio. And so thinking of that very specific thing, something that came up for us was how heavily militarized Customs and Border Patrol and our immigration system is, and how people are not only, things aren't enforced as they're coming in, but also as they're going out. And so that alone, that was a pivotal moment in the film, I think, for me, that highlighted something so real that I don't think many people know or understand, that even to go back to their home country, to be reunited with their families is constantly happening for our community. And so that being said, what was about that moment that you thought that I need to highlight that in the film?
Well, that's a very good question, because I feel like I didn't think about it as I started with that kernel of an idea. It didn't really even cross my mind. I think it was after we started seeing a lot of what happened in 2017, 2018, etc., with family separation, and I started reading more about it. And I started hearing people sharing their stories as to sometimes cases of people wanted to go back home, and then there's a process for deportation that has to happen, that sometimes, actually I would say most of the time, doesn't happen the way it should happen. And even the stories that I heard, for instance, one person who told me, somebody who was an undocumented immigrant who also served in the army, that he was appalled how things changed for him when once they found out that he was a veteran, that he was treated in a very inhumane way. But somehow when he mentioned that he'd been in the army, it was the opposite way, and then ended up letting him go. To a point that he was like, wait, what? So they have the ability to do this not only correctly, but even more quickly and more humanely. That why isn't this the case? And after seeing Arpaio being pardoned, but also having been through the glory days of Arpaio pre-President 45, like as you said, those things we those of us who are in the community who are paying attention, we know these things have been happening for a long time. I used to talk about with other activists and people in 2012 about these things, and a lot of people were not even aware of how insidious this was, and especially in the southwest of the country and in Arizona, California. Like it was insane. So as we were developing the movie and as we were fleshing out the journey, but again, being mindful that this ended up happening somewhere in the late 90s for Flavio, how it happened back then, how it was, even because people were, even the general public was even less aware of what was going on. It was even more the wild west of what was allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, who was, if they were taking proper care of people, if they were not, how much authority the local authority, non-immigration authorities had over people who were immigrants should be in the hands of immigration authorities. So I'm like I've said before, I don't believe as a filmmaker in creating movies with a message, right? Like to say this is my propaganda or this is. I think that the most helpful use for film is to start a conversation and to get people to ask questions and to go online and to talk to, because at the end of the day, the core of the movie is family, and it's also about looking into your family's history and asking questions and be prepared to feel empathy, to forgive, to put yourself in the shoes of those people who were just trying to do their best and rolling with the punches and trying to do the best for what they thought was the best decision at the time.
Yeah, I love that, Eduardo. I think that adds a lot of substance to the work that we do. You know, like you mentioned, specifically being in Arizona, where during Arpaio was a whole other fight. You know, I mean, there are people in our team, very specifically our chief of advocacy, who was very involved in that movement and in trying to eradicate a lot of that. And you know, thinking of what you just said of what that used to look like back in the 90s versus even what looks like for the past 4 years, the difference is stark. But the reoccurring theme is that what you said, that these things have constantly happened in very different forms. You know, for Flavio and Renato, it was not being able to go back home to be with Renato, right? And what that meant for him coming here. And so thinking of those things, something else that popped into my head as you were talking about, this is a movie about family and about really piecing those immigrant stories together. Many of the actors in the film, they themselves are immigrants, and so, and have their own complex immigration story. No immigration story is the same, and so how did their personal experiences help you shape the film? And you know, in thinking through the many different forms of family separation.
It was a very interesting process, and I don't know if it's more common than I hear, but in the case of this movie, every time we would share the script, even as we were writing the script, but as we would share the script with talent, with the key people and the you know, behind the camera, they would start sharing more about their own background and their own stories and how the movie reflected that story of what it felt like to be separated uh, from their family. And like you said, everybody had their own very different version. But there's, for instance, Pia Watson, who plays Pamela, Renato's fiance. She actually was born in San Miguel de Allende, which we didn't know.
Mm.
Her dad is American. His mom was Mexican. They were, her parents were separated. I understand, but so she was grew up in Mexico, but at some point she had to go. It's not my place to tell her story, but at some point in life she had to go back to the U.S. and join that family, that second family, and adjust. And it was a very alienating experience. And so, but she shared all of this after we hired her for the job, and then as we were shooting in New Mexico, and we have again people from the cast, from the crew coming in and going like, I cried, I read the story because it reminded me of this thing, it reminded me of my dad and or my dad who was deported, or and so forth. So it was really important for me to find a way to at least capture the spirit of it. Again, I don't intend to speak for on behalf of everyone. It was not our intention to speak on behalf of every Latino and every, not even every Mexican immigrant or Mexican American, but to understand the common threats of that. And it brings me back to something that you were saying when as we in the Latinx community, especially those of us who live in LA in a bit of our own Latinx bubbles of community, and we started looking at the way other people think in other parts of the country. And what I tell people is there are uh, people out there in different parts of the country who have never had a human interaction with a Latinx immigrant or Mexican American immigrant, who maybe their exposure in many parts of the country, that their exposure, they maybe see somebody in the back of the kitchen, but they don't really speak to them, if that, right? And their only information comes from what they watch on TV or in movies. And when I think we all know what that is. When you turn on the TV, you watch movies, and you see people of color, but specifically Latinx characters. And there's many studies about how little it is and how bad it is. So it is more difficult to humanize somebody when all you have is that. So in creating Flavio, Renato, and all the characters, Pamela, etc., Tere, we try to give them as much humanity as possible, because we want to also people to understand, number one, what it was for them back home, right? That is not the world of Sicario or the tax collector. Of other movies have decided to portray that part of Mexico, that many of us who are here miss our homeland, right? We miss what it was like to be in El Pueblo or wherever we were, and we miss the food, and we miss the people, and we miss the characters. So the opening sequence, I really hope for all of those who are watching and who watched the movie, I really hope that you got a little taste of what it was to be back there. So it was important to give that piece of humanity, what it was like back then. And also it was important to give a piece of humanity in that we are not defined by our immigrant experience. It is played a very important part in our life, but we are many other things. We have dreams. We want to travel the world, and we want to build companies, and we are heartbreak, and we get married, and we have passions and hobbies, and we have our own individual stories. So we are not defined by this. We're not defined by trauma. in the way. And so in the movie is a big that where it's not being defined by trauma, and not let that trauma define who you are. And it's a little bit
Mm.
of what we're going through as well. So we are many other pieces, and we like different movies. Like some of us, like in the movie, like horror movies. So uh, we are human. So I'm hoping that we keep this momentum in Hollywood to keep humanizing people from the Latinx community. And I have the privilege of being good friends with people like Moises Zamora, who's the showrunner, and Selena created the show Selena for Netflix with Stephen Canals, who created Pose. And each one of us trying to speak to a different, Tanya Saracho created Vita, um, each one of us speaking to a different, very different thing, what it means to be a Latino queer woman in Los Angeles versus New York, etc. Right? So I'm hoping we're all trying to create this momentum and a snowball of stories that will reach out people. And I'm hoping that people help us too by
Yeah.
supporting the movie and spreading the word. Tell if you like it, at least a little bit. Uh, just I wouldn't push so hard if these were normal times. We live in a world where it's kind of right now the circumstance is hard to cut through the noise.
Mhm.
So I think it's a little extra important to amplify those stories that humanizes. So it becomes harder and harder to treat us like we're not human.
Mhm. I love that. Qué bonito, Eduardo. I love that so much because it's so true, something that we're constantly battling in our line of work is um that monolith, that stereotype of who immigrants are, right? And I love what you emphasized, how we are not defined by trauma. And some of the most beautiful work I see in our organization is by our organizers who work with people who are directly impacted, and how they organize to mobilize and create change. And something that I often see in the community is la gente doesn't give up, and they have so much power, so much fire. They are so empowered, and they're not voiceless, and they want to fight and push for change, right? And so I love that you highlighted that, because our communities are often seen as being defined by trauma, and therefore seen as um, acting based on that, right? But the reality is that we like so many different things. We are so different, and we are powerful and have a big voice. And so I love what you said, and how um, in a way, films like the ones you created really help amplify that and amplify that feeling. I love it so much. Um, I want to ask you one last question, and we can say our sweet goodbyes. But um, you said earlier that this film is about empathy and about family, and really understanding um, what that means, very specifically through the experience of Renato and his brother Asher in trying to figure that out. So with all of that said, did anything change for you when it comes to immigration and how it affects our communities? Very specifically honing in on that empathy.
Um, if anything, it just made me want to uh, just work harder to get people to understand the nuance of what it is to be an immigrant, and all the different shapes that it can take. Um, I'm just hoping at least that people develop the curiosity to look into it a little bit more. And I'll tell you why, because uh, I'm not only concerned about the people who vilify us, and I'm not only concerned about people who demonizes. I'm also concerned about the people who use us for virtual signaling, or maybe even have good intentions, but don't have a full picture of what's going on, and trivialize or simplify what is a big historical multi-layered phenomenon. So it's not as simple as you said. It's not like one day, you know, Trump woke up and decided to put children in cages, and that's what happened. I mean, I think it's the easiest way to sell the message, but I think it's way more. It's yes, it was part of that, and yes, it's terrible, but it didn't start yesterday, and it's not only limited to that, right? It takes many shape or forms, and I'm hoping that people leave with that curiosity. Again, I'm not equipped to educate people on the subject because I'm not an expert. I think our first and most important goal was to create a story that was entertaining, that people can enjoy at home, that people have a little bit of catharsis that we certainly did not know was going to be needed when we were making the movie. But a word that's been coming back to us a lot by people who watch the movie, that they laugh, that they've been moved by the story, and I give them a release that they needed after the last few months. So that was our main goal. If we didn't do that right, and everything else wouldn't matter. So that was our first goal. But in addition to that, I'm hoping in the future to educate myself more, and not necessarily educate other people, because it's not always within my possibilities, but at least motivate people to learn more and to not stay quiet when injustice happens.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. That is very powerful. You know, it's very powerful, and thank you for creating a film that, as you said, was so cathartic. For the last 4 years, I have been just clenching my wrists and waiting for the next terrible thing. And I watch films like yours, and it's like, sí, sí se puede, sí podemos, it's fine, right? So thank you so much, Eduardo. I'm so grateful to have had this time with you and to talk about the film. Thank you, all of you who joined us in watching the film yourselves. Tell your friends about it. It's a great, funny film, and it is very true to form to what our community experience is. So it's a phenomenal tool to begin that conversation about immigration, as Eduardo stated. So appreciate you all. Much love, abrazos, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.